Again, and welcome back to Educator.com's Introduction to PHP course. In today's lesson, we're going to be continuing our discussion of conditional loops. Specifically, we're going to be introducing a new style of conditional loops known as a do-while loop. We're going to be talking about both the continue statement and revisiting the break statement and seeing how they apply for loops, including the while and the do-while loop. We're going to talk about infinite loops and some common pitfalls that occur in creating infinite loops. And we're going to talk about what infinite loops are. And then we're going to talk about coding conventions as they apply to the do-while loop. So the do-while loop essentially functions the same way as a while loop does. The only difference is that before entering a do-while loop for the first time, the test condition doesn't get evaluated. In a do-while loop, as you can see down here, the test condition is at the bottom of the do-while loop, and it uses the same while keyword. Basically what happens when you enter a do-while loop, upon entering, you go ahead and you execute the statement group within the do curly braces. Then after you've executed that, you evaluate the test condition specified here in the while statement. If the test condition is still true, you continue and you go ahead and evaluate the loop again. So the difference between this and the while loop is that the test condition is evaluated after the loop is run as opposed to the beginning. So what that implies is that in a do-while loop, its statement group is always going to get executed at least once, meaning you'll always work through this group at least one time before you evaluate the test condition. So let's actually go ahead, just erase this. Let's go ahead and take a look at the do-while loop, a script that makes use of the do-while loop. Here's an extremely simple example. Within the do statement group, we just have simply have an echo statement that says in the do-while statement group. So when you enter this do-while loop, what you're going to do is you're going to go ahead and always execute the statements within the loop first. Then you're going to evaluate the test condition to see whether you should evaluate it again. And in this case, for a while test condition, we have it set equal to false. So that's always going to, because the literal value false, it's always going to evaluate to false. So in this case, this do statement and the do statement group is only going to get executed once. So for example, if we go and run this file, we can see that in do-while statement group, that string was only output one time. Now this is in contrast to, let's say we switch this around from a do loop to a while loop. The do-while loop always has its statement group executed once. However, a do-while loop only a while loop only has its statement executed if the condition is true on its initial run. So when we go ahead and run the script, while false, the test condition false is always going to evaluate to false. So this while loop is actually never going to get executed. So when we go ahead and refresh the page, looks like we had an extra curly brace. When we go ahead and refresh the page, we're actually going to see that nothing gets output. And that's because this while loop never actually gets entered. Now one other thing to note about the syntax of the do-while loop is that the while loop comes at, or the while keyword and its test condition come after the closing brace of the do statement group. And then also you need to notice that there has to be a semicolon after the test condition for a while loop. So this really is a example of a do-while loop that doesn't do too much. So created another example here that does something a little more interesting. And it demonstrates the example, an example of when you would use a do-while loop. Because do-while loops always execute at least once. You use it in scenarios where you want something to be done once, and then if it doesn't work, a test condition evaluates maybe to false still. You continue to do it until things happen. Well, a common thing in computer programming is sometimes you need to, if you have a server running, you need to bind to a particular port. And so what you do is in your server application, you try to bind to a specific port. And if you are successful, but not all ports are available. So if you're successful in binding a particular port, let's say your operation is done. However, if you try to bind to, let's say, port 500 and you use some outside function to do that, and it returns false saying that you can't bind to that port, then you need to try again. So this is a perfect example where we could use a do while loop. So I've actually created a sort of this little mock function that might be used to bind to a particular port. Basically, it takes one parameter that's an integer function. That's an integer variable. And what it does is, if the value provided is greater than 10 and less than 90, so if it's between 10 and 90, then it's going to return the value that you passed in, which essentially is saying that it was successful. If is less than 10 or greater than 90, it's going to return null, saying that, which implies that it wasn't successful in binding to the port. Now, a real network application would have more advanced stuff going on here, but this is sort of just a mock function to allow us to explore the do while loop. So basically, we're going to create a variable outside of the do while loop called random port. Called bound port. Just going to set it equal to null to start off with. And then we're going to create the way we're going to manage the while loop, or the do while loop, to exit out of it is by using a Boolean flag. So we're going to say is bound to, which means if the port was bound to, then we're not going to execute the loop anymore. We're going to initially set that to false. Then within our do while loop, we're going to generate a random port number between 1 and 100, and we're going to use the rand function as we had in a previous lecture. And we're going to make use of our bind to port function that we defined down here to try and see if we were able to successfully bind to a port, which would give us a condition to test. So we're going to pass it random port, which is a randomly generated port number between 1 and 100. Now, if this function successfully binds to a port, it's going to return the integer that we passed into it, and it's going to return it as bound port. If it fails, it's going to return the value null. So what we can do is we can then create a test that says if bound port is not equal to null, which means that it was successful, then we're going to go ahead and set the Boolean flag is bound to equal to true. And then as our test condition, after we evaluate this do statement group for the first time, we're going to test if is bound to is true or not. If is bound to is false, which means that this operation didn't succeed, then is bound to is still going to be false because that's what it was initialized to. Not false is true, so it's going to execute again. However, if we were successful in binding to a port, bound port's not going to be equal to null. Is bound to is going to get set equal to true, and then not true is false, so the loop's going to exit. And then we're just going to afterwards enter a message that says successfully bound to and then the value of bound port, which is the variable that was returned by bind to port. So if we go ahead and run this example, we can see it said it was successfully bound to port 27. Now what that means is that do while loop only had to execute one time, and we know that because actually one thing we should have done, forgot to include a message that says attempting to bind to port we're actually, every time we go through the do while loop, we're going to enter output a message that says we're attempting to bind to port random port, which is the random port regenerated. Then after we've successfully bound to the port, then we output a successful message. So when we go ahead and reload the page, we can see it was attempted to bind to port 23, which means it was in that do loop. It succeeded on the first time, and then we output a message successfully bound to port 33. Now if we refresh the page, second time it worked on the first time, third time it didn't work, and it looks like I forgot a break statement here. Because this rand function is not always going to return an integer between 10 and 90, sometimes this bind to port function is going to fail. It's going to return null. So we have to execute the while loop again, the do while loop again. So this time when I refreshed it, it successfully bound the first time. Let me just do it a couple times. Now it took 2 times to actually bind to port. It tried to bind to port 1, but 1 is not between 10 and 90, so it didn't succeed. When it generated the random port 85, that's between 10 and 90, so it successfully is able to bind to it.